There is a quiet assumption most people carry without ever quite stating it out loud. It goes something like this, that somewhere beneath the surface of who we are right now, there is a version of ourselves that is unfinished, slightly defective, or not yet acceptable. As though the present moment were a rough draft, and life itself were a long editing process aimed at correcting mistakes we didn't know we were making. This assumption rarely announces itself dramatically. It hums softly in the background, shaping how effort feels, how rest feels, how waiting feels. Even moments of satisfaction can carry a subtle aftertaste of incompleteness, as if they arrived too early, before the work was truly done. And what is curious about this assumption is how human it is. Not in the sense of being noble or tragic, but in how easily it forgets the rest of the world. A tree does not wake up in the morning wondering whether its branches are unfolding correctly. A river does not pause midstream to consider whether it should flow more efficiently, more gracefully, or with better intentions. Clouds do not hold meetings about whether they deserve to be clouds yet, or whether they must first improve their shape. They simply occur. They happen in full, without apology, without rehearsal, without the burden of becoming something else in order to justify what they already are. Somewhere along the way, humans learned to experience themselves not as events, but as projects, something to be managed, adjusted, upgraded. And once this happens, the mind begins to behave like a workshop that never quite closes for the day. There is always another loose screw, another area to refine, another flaw that reveals itself the moment the last one appears to be fixed. The language around this becomes very convincing. Growth, improvement, healing, optimization. All words that sound gentle, even kind, yet quietly imply that what is here now is insufficient on its own. Imagine, for a moment, a musical note being played. Not a melody, just a single note. It does not attempt to justify its existence by becoming another note. It does not rush to resolve itself into harmony. While it sounds, it is complete. When it fades, it is complete in a different way. If the note were to become self-conscious, if it began asking whether it was resonating properly, or whether it might sound better if it strained a little harder, the music would not improve. It would fracture. The very effort to perfect it would distort the thing it was trying to protect. In much the same way, the sense of me often tightens around an idea of improvement. Identity becomes something that must be defended, corrected, or enhanced. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the simple fact of being turns into a performance. Not for others necessarily, but for an internal audience that is never quite satisfied. This audience keeps records. It remembers past failures, compares them to imagined futures, and narrates the present as a temporary holding area rather than a place where life is actually happening. What makes this especially compelling is that the effort to fix oneself often feels virtuous. It feels responsible. After all, isn't it careless to accept things as they are? Isn't that how stagnation begins? And yet, notice how this question already assumes that acceptance and movement are opposites, as though to stop struggling were to stop living. The mind loves clean divisions like this. It prefers binaries, forward or backward, improving or failing, aware or asleep. But lived experience is rarely so neat. Most of the time, it is ambiguous, overlapping, unresolved. And it is precisely this ambiguity that the urge to fix oneself tries to escape. When identity becomes rigid around the idea of deficiency, tension follows naturally. There is pressure to maintain progress, anxiety about regression, and a constant scanning for signs that something is still wrong. Even moments of calm can feel suspicious, as if peace itself were merely avoidance. The body may sit still, but the mind continues to lean forward, searching for the next task, the next realization, the next version of itself that will finally feel adequate. Yet notice something subtle here. The feeling of being not enough is itself an experience that is fully present. It does not exist halfway. It is not incomplete. It arises, it is felt, it changes. In that sense, even the sense of inadequacy is whole while it lasts. It is not a crack in reality. It is part of the texture of reality. And when this is seen, not as a concept but as a lived observation, something begins to soften. Not because a problem has been solved, but because the frame around the problem loosens. Everyday life continues, of course. People go to work, lose time, miss chances, remember things too late. Relationships stretch and contract. Days pass without ceremony. And within all of this, the idea of fixing oneself keeps trying to insert a finish line into a process that does not have one. As if life were a rehearsal for a performance that never quite arrives. As if being here now were only valuable insofar as it prepares for a better moment later. Perhaps what feels most unsettling is not the absence of perfection, but the quiet realization that there is nothing standing behind the present moment waiting to approve it. No final authority to declare it sufficient. The experience is simply happening, already underway, already full in its own peculiar, unfinished way. And whether that feels comforting or disorienting depends largely on how tightly the mind is holding on to the idea that something essential is missing. There is an odd habit the mind has of treating the present moment like a rough neighborhood you're only passing through. You don't decorate. You don't settle in. You keep your bags packed because, surely, the real place is somewhere else. Somewhere cleaner. Quieter. More resolved. And so attention leans forward, not aggressively, but persistently, as though life itself were always about to begin just after this moment finishes explaining itself. This leaning forward creates a subtle distortion in perception. Experience is no longer something unfolding. It becomes something evaluated. Each feeling is checked against an internal standard. Each reaction is measured for correctness. Even silence is interrogated. Am I calm for the right reasons? Is this peace genuine? Or am I merely avoiding something important? And without noticing it, the mind has turned being into a kind of audit, where nothing is simply allowed to be what it is without commentary. Think again of something ordinary, something so commonplace it rarely attracts philosophical attention. Consider breathing. Not controlled breathing, not techniques, not improvement. Just the quiet, involuntary rhythm of air moving in and out. You don't correct your breath all day long. You don't keep score of how well you inhaled this morning. And yet it continues, faithfully, without asking for instruction. The moment you try to improve it unnecessarily, it becomes awkward, shallow, forced. What was effortless becomes tense, not because it was broken, but because it was interfered with. The same pattern appears in how people relate to their inner lives. Thoughts arise, and instead of being noticed, they are immediately recruited as evidence. Evidence of progress. Evidence of failure. Evidence that one is getting closer or drifting farther away from some imagined state of wholeness. And identity hardens around this evaluation. I am someone who is working on myself. It sounds harmless, even admirable, but embedded in it is the quiet presumption that the self, as it appears now, is provisional. Once this presumption takes hold, time itself becomes heavy. The past turns into a catalog of errors or lessons. The future becomes a container for redemption, and the present, squeezed between them, feels thin, almost unreal. You are here, but not entirely. Part of you is already negotiating with tomorrow, asking it to finally deliver what today cannot. And so anxiety does not arrive as panic or drama. It arrives as impatience with the moment itself. What's fascinating is that this impatience often disguises itself as care. I just want to be better, one says. I just want to heal. But notice how these desires place fulfillment slightly out of reach, as though it were irresponsible to feel at ease now. As though satisfaction must be earned retroactively, after all the internal renovations are complete. And yet, the renovations never end, because the blueprint keeps changing. Each insight creates a new standard. Each realization opens a new gap. The mind, in this state, becomes a mirror that cannot stop adjusting itself. Every reflection is scrutinized, every flaw magnified, and the more closely it looks, the more it finds to correct. Not because there is more wrong, but because attention trained on fixing will always discover something that appears fixable. This is not a personal failure. It is simply how a problem-solving mechanism behaves when it turns inward without restraint. In daily life, this shows up in small, almost invisible ways. You finish a task, and instead of resting, you replay it, editing what could have been done differently. You receive kindness, and instead of letting it land, you question whether you deserved it. You feel content for a brief moment, and immediately wonder how long it will last, or what it means that it arrived so easily. Contentment, under this lens, feels suspicious, like a loophole. But experience itself does not share this suspicion. Feelings come and go without commentary. Sensations arise without needing justification. The body responds before the mind has time to interpret, and in those unguarded moments, laughing unexpectedly, losing track of time, being absorbed in something simple, there is often a faint sense of relief, not because something was fixed, but because the fixing paused. The internal supervisor stepped out of the room. This pause is often misunderstood. It is not a breakthrough. It is not a realization to be captured and repeated. The moment you try to claim it, it slips back into effort. Rather, it is more like the background noise of self-correction dropping away for a second, revealing that nothing was missing during its absence. Life did not stall. Identity did not collapse. The world continued, quietly indifferent to whether you were improving or not. Perhaps what creates the most strain is the belief that letting go of the urge to fix oneself means giving up on depth, meaning, or seriousness, as though acceptance were the same as indifference. But this confuses softness with carelessness. The river does not stop carving valleys because it accepts gravity. It flows precisely because it does not argue with it. In the same way, experience unfolds not because it is corrected, but because it is allowed. When this is overlooked, tension becomes chronic. Not sharp enough to demand attention, but constant enough to color everything. A sense that something needs to be done before one can finally arrive. And yet, arrive where? The question rarely has a clear answer. It is more a feeling than a destination, a vague sense of not yet, hovering over the present like unfinished business. And still, here you are, breathing, listening, existing without having completed yourself. The fact that this feels ordinary is precisely the point. There is no fanfare announcing adequacy, no signal that the effort can finally stop. There is just the ongoing fact of experience, already full, already moving, whether or not the mind agrees that it is enough. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much, but from monitoring oneself too closely while doing it. It's the fatigue of self-surveillance. The constant low-level effort of asking, am I doing this right? Not just with tasks, but with feelings, reactions, even silence. And because this questioning rarely stops completely, rest becomes conditional. You don't simply rest, you rest with one eye open, ready to assess whether the rest itself is productive. Over time, identity starts to contract around this vigilance. You are no longer simply someone who experiences thoughts and emotions. You become the one responsible for managing them correctly. Certain feelings are welcomed, others subtly resisted. Some states are labeled progress, others regression. And slowly, a hierarchy forms inside the mind, not announced but felt. Calm above confusion, clarity above doubt, acceptance above resistance. The irony, of course, is that this hierarchy is precisely what keeps the system tense. Because now every moment must be sorted before it can be lived. Consider how strange this would look if applied outwardly. Imagine insisting that the weather justify itself, that the rain explain why it is raining, or the heat apologize for being heavy. Imagine standing outside, correcting the sky. It would feel absurd, and yet inwardly this is often treated as normal. The inner world becomes a space where nothing is allowed to arrive unannounced. where every sensation must pass through inspection before being granted permission to stay. This is where anxiety quietly settles in, not always as fear, but as tightness, a subtle resistance to what is already happening, the sense that experience needs to be slightly different. The more earnestly one wants to be whole, the more fractured things can feel. What's rarely questioned is the assumption underneath all of this, that there exists a version of you who is finally finished, a self that no longer needs adjustment, a stable endpoint where effort relaxes permanently. But when you look closely, this self is always abstract. It lives in thought, not in experience. It is described, imagined, anticipated, but never encountered. And yet, enormous energy is spent trying to reach it, as though it were just one insight away. Meanwhile, the self that actually shows up each day, the one that feels bored, curious, irritated, tender, distracted, keeps being treated as a temporary inconvenience, something to move through rather than live from. And so even authenticity becomes performative. You are authentic, but with an agenda. Vulnerable, but strategically. Honest, but only in ways that align with improvement. The spontaneity of being gives way to the choreography of becoming. Everyday situations make this visible if you watch gently. A conversation where you are half listening, half evaluating how you're coming across. A moment alone where silence immediately triggers the need to work on something. Even joy can feel incomplete if it doesn't fit the story of progress, as though happiness must serve a purpose beyond itself, or it risks being wasted. And yet, there are moments, usually unplanned, where this whole structure loosens. You forget yourself for a second, not in a dramatic way, just enough that the commentary fades. You're absorbed in movement, in sound, in attention itself. In those moments, the question of adequacy doesn't arise, not because it has been answered, but because it has lost relevance. You don't feel enough. You don't feel fixed. You simply feel present. These moments are often dismissed as distractions or escapes, but notice how they carry a peculiar clarity. Not the clarity of understanding something new, but the clarity of not needing to understand yourself at all, the sense of being aligned without effort. And when the mind returns, as it inevitably does, it often tries to capture this state, to recreate it deliberately. But the very act of chasing it reintroduces the tension that made it feel rare in the first place. This is not a personal mistake, it is the nature of control. Control functions by narrowing, by defining outcomes, by preferring one state over another. And while this works beautifully for building bridges or organizing schedules, it becomes problematic when turned inward indiscriminately. The inner world is not a machine to be calibrated. It is a process, fluid and responsive, changing even as you try to hold it still. The idea that you are already enough can sound sentimental if it is heard as reassurance. But reassurance misses the point. This is not about convincing yourself of worth. It's about noticing that worth is not an attribute you carry or earn. It's a concept layered onto experience after the fact. Experience itself does not ask whether it deserves to exist. It simply does. And you are not separate from that process. You are one of its expressions. When this is overlooked, the effort to fix oneself becomes a kind of background noise, so familiar it feels like identity. Letting go of it can feel disorienting, even irresponsible. If you're not fixing, what are you doing? Who are you? These questions arise not because something is wrong, but because the reference point has shifted. The mind is used to orienting around tension. When tension softens, it momentarily loses its bearings. And perhaps that is where the discomfort lives, not in being incomplete, but in sensing that completeness was never the right frame to begin with. There is a subtle grief that often goes unnoticed in all this effort to improve. It is the grief of missing one's own life while preparing for a better version of it. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, ordinary ways. Moments pass unregistered because attention is elsewhere, rehearsing, correcting, anticipating. And when those moments are later remembered, they appear strangely thin, as if something essential was never fully present to begin with. This is not because you failed to be mindful enough or aware enough. It is because the frame through which experience was filtered never quite allowed it to land. When life is approached as something to be fixed, the present becomes a checkpoint rather than a dwelling place. You pass through it, collecting data, but you don't stay. And over time, this creates a faint sense of disconnection, not from the world, but from the immediacy of being part of it. In everyday terms, this can feel like constantly arriving late to your own experience. Conversations feel slightly ahead of you. Emotions register after they've already shifted. Even solitude can feel crowded, filled with commentary about how solitude should feel. And yet, nothing is actually wrong in these moments. They are complete as they are. It is only the interpretation layered on top that insists otherwise. The idea of fixing yourself depends on a very specific image of time. It assumes a linear path, past mistakes, present effort, future resolution. But lived time is not so obedient. It loops, overlaps, thickens. Old feelings return in new contexts. Insights fade and reappear differently. You don't move through life like a project plan. Life moves through you, reshaping itself moment by moment. Trying to finalize this process is like trying to finish a conversation that is still speaking. What often goes unexamined is the relief that comes from dropping the assumption that there is something fundamentally wrong with how you are showing up. Not relief as pleasure, but relief as space. The space that appears when experience no longer has to justify itself. When thoughts are allowed to be thoughts, feelings allowed to be feelings, without immediately being recruited into a narrative of improvement or failure. This doesn't produce a permanent state. Nothing does. But it does change the texture of ordinary moments. Waiting becomes just waiting. Uncertainty becomes just uncertainty, not a sign that you are behind. Even confusion can be met without the extra layer of self-judgment. And in that sense, life becomes less of a performance and more of a participation. You are not watching yourself live. You are living. Notice how different this feels from the promise of self-fixing. There is no arrival, no final clarity, no badge of completion. There is only the ongoing fact of experience, unfolding without asking permission. The urge to fix may still arise. Old habits don't disappear simply because they are seen. But when they arise within a larger context, one where they are not in charge of defining what you are. This is perhaps the quiet shift at the heart of it, not a solution, but a reorientation. From treating yourself as an object that needs adjustment, to recognizing yourself as a process that is already in motion. From relating to life as a problem to be solved, to encountering it as something that is happening with or without your approval. And in the midst of ordinary days, missed trains, half-finished conversations, plans that change, there may be brief moments where the effort drops, not intentionally, but naturally. A laugh that comes without explanation. A pause that doesn't demand to be filled. A sense, fleeting and unremarkable, that nothing needs to be added to this moment for it to be what it is. If that feels unsettling, it is likely because the mind has been trained to equate tension with meaning, to assume that effort is what makes life real. And yet, here is life, continuing regardless, breathing, sensing, responding. Not perfected, not resolved, but undeniably present. And perhaps that is enough, not as a conclusion, not as a belief to adopt, but as a simple observation. That the search for completion has always been happening inside what is